and welcome back to the mother of all archive history lessons. Yep, it's time for another installment of the history of VHS. And this time around, we're really gonna start folding in more of the techie stuff. But I should note that you may very well notice that some fairly significant stuff does not get discussed here. And that's because I'm putting the cutoff date, unless contextually necessary, at 1988 today. And the reason it's 1988 is because that was the year that Sony, the purveyors of Betamax, finally broke down and started manufacturing VHS decks, and effectively ending the format war in the process. So if I don't mention things like ultra-long tapes or the quirky, short-lived VLP tape speed and some of that other stuff, it's just because we haven't gotten there yet. But anyway, the bulk of today's episode is going to be devoted to one last long and hopefully truly final look at the VHS Betamax format war. At least final here in archive land. And then the remainder of the episode will be devoted to the first offshoot of VHS, namely compact VHS, better known as VHS-C. So we've got plenty to talk about today, so let's get to it.
Boy, if you're a TV freak like I am, you're gonna love what you're about to see. Let me demonstrate how Select-O-Vision works.
Rather amusingly, the initial specs of both VHS and Betamax were dictated by some rather inflexible engineers for both products. It took the demands of consumers and marketing departments to drive most of the innovations. For starters, the first round of JVC VHS decks in late 1976, like the first Sony Betamax a year earlier, could only record at one speed. Having said that, during Betamax's development period, RCA got a glimpse of the prototype. Unimpressed by Beta's 1-hour recording time, an RCA representative inquired about a longer, slower playtime, like reel-to-reel audio tapes have. Sony responded that they felt it would eventually be possible, but would likely never be implemented, as the video quality would be unacceptable. When RCA hitched their wagon to the 2-hour VHS, they were met with the same response from JVC engineers. As such, RCA went to work on developing their own long play system, the idea being that a tape must be capable of recording an entire football game. When the first RCA VHS dropped in August of 1977, the long play option was included, allowing for up to 4 hours of record time.
Make that pledge. You'll feel better if you do. If you pledge $15, we can send you the story of the career of Betty Davis by Whitney Stein, accompanied by a running and witty narrative by Betty Davis.
Later in the year, Sony countered with the SL7200, which introduced their own half-speed recording option, as well as a bit of a rebranding. The original Betamax tapes were labeled as K30 and K60, representing the tape's potential record time, in minutes, obviously. The old K-series tapes were replaced with the more impressive-sounding L-series, L250 and L500, respectively replacing K30 and K60. 250 and 500 were the approximate length of tape in feet. To further compete with RCA, in late 1978, Sony introduced the L750, bumping potential record time up to 3 hours.
In the 61st Indianapolis 500, at this stage of the race, we now have 15 cars out of the race.
This new beta speed, known alternatively as X2 or B2, came at the cost of lowering Beta's 250 lines of horizontal resolution to only 240, making it effectively equivalent to standard mode VHS in the process. Wanting a leg up on VHS, in 1979, Sony introduced the SL5400, which introduced a 1/3 speed option, read X3 or B3, as well as the new L830 tape length, manufactured using thinner tape stock to make up for the lack of space in a Beta cassette. These tapes were not recommended for use at B1 speed. Anyway, an L830 tape could record up to 5 hours in this new B3 mode, finally besting VHS, but only briefly. Not to be outdone, RCA went to work on their own 1/3 speed format. This became known as SLP mode, or super long play, which was introduced via the RCA Selectavision 600 in the fall of 1979. SLP, also known as EP, or extended play, allowed users to record up to 6 hours of material on a standard T120 cassette. In 1978, Sony introduced the first Beta deck with stereo sound, but only on one of their industrial models, namely the SLO-323. While that was followed with a precious few Japan-only stereo machines, it took until 1982 for the first internationally released stereo consumer deck, the Marantz VR200, which also happened to be the only Beta deck with Dolby C noise reduction. The first stereo VHS deck arrived sometime in the latter half of 1980 via the Akai VPS-7350, also known for being a rare keylock unit. The first stereo home videotapes arrived in mid-1981 with the VHS issues of Michael Nesmith's Elephant Parts and Tom Jones' Live in Las Vegas, both equipped with Dolby no less. In 1982, MCA made stereo a requirement for all their VHS and Beta releases, where possible at least. Dolby wasn't implemented until 1983. And speaking of hi-fi Luton audio,
sound has a look all its own, but it never looked like much on a home video cassette recorder.
In January of 1983, Sony announced the introduction of Beta Hi-Fi sound. The first model, namely the SL5200, was released in June. Sony also created a short series of outboard hi-fi processors to hook to an existing machine. Beta Hi-Fi took the old best case frequency response of 50 to 10,000 Hz, not quite on par with a basic Type 1 audio cassette, and bumped it up to the near CD level spec of 20 to 20,000 Hz. Before the end of the summer, VHS retaliated with the JVC HRD725. While it and subsequent hi-fi decks matched Beta Hi-Fi's frequency response, it had a distinct disadvantage to Beta. Beta was able to use the existing video heads for recording and playback. VHS required an extra set of audio heads. Beta was also allocated 500 kHz for hi-fi audio, while VHS only got 150 kHz. Most commonly, VHS hi-fi was prone to interference and playback issues across multiple machines. That and extra wear and tear on your tapes.
Now, people are always asking me about the reindeer. Let me tell you a little story that happened last Christmas Eve. And that's one reason we're doing so much practicing this year.
By 1985, VHS was outselling Betamax by about a 5-to-1 ratio. In the name of gaining market share, spoiler alert, it didn't work, in January of that year, Sony announced the Super Beta pseudo format. The idea was that by upping the luminance carrier by 800 kilohertz and narrowing the gap between the VCR's heads and your tapes, they could squeeze in just over a 20% improvement in horizontal resolution. Read, you could now get 290 lines as opposed to only 240. In the bargain, the amount of degradation in signal in dubbed tapes was minimized. Because, of course, we all got to get our camcorder footage transferred and edited and not dub our rental movies, right? Anyway, this did come at a cost, both in price and quality. The initial line of Super Beta machines ran from $550 to $1,500. And despite claims to the contrary, Super Beta wasn't quite upward compatible with standard Betamax. The picture and sound quality were known to have a few artifacts on non-Beta Hi-Fi and/or Super Beta machines. Still acceptable, though. Later in the year, JVC introduced VHS-HQ, high quality, which, while truly upward and downward compatible, not to mention most VHS decks made from about 1986 on have VHS-HQ circuitry, the quality difference was negligible, getting you about a 3% improvement in signal-to-noise ratio. The best thing to come out of VHS-HQ was that bright whites may look a hair smoother and less blown out. That's about it.
Just hold your head up high, and nothing is worth doing unless you do it right.
You can't buy Walter Payton's new record, but you can get it free with the purchase of a 3, 5, or 9-piece dinner.
Similar to Super Beta, in 1987, the Super VHS, or SVHS, pseudo format was introduced. SVHS easily jumped right past Super Beta in terms of quality, almost into Laserdisc territory, delivering up to 420 lines of horizontal resolution. Laserdisc could deliver up to 425. While SVHS was backward compatible, it was not forward compatible. In other words, an SVHS deck is 100% compatible with standard VHS, but SVHS is not necessarily compatible with regular VHS decks. I mean, you can stick an SVHS tape in any regular VHS deck and sustain no damage, but depending on your model, the material may or may not be watchable. It's kind of a crapshoot. Anyway, while SVHS never sold too well, it did manage to become a favorite of prosumer users, often as a means of shooting, transferring, and editing camcorder footage. As for me, I use an SVHS deck for general VHS transfers, just for that little extra bit of stability, thanks to the S-Video jack. As for the rest of the SVHS saga, well, that's a story for Volume 3.
If you own a beta format VCR, you may have noticed that it's become increasingly difficult to buy or rent pre-recorded product on that format. The maker of the beta machine has noticed as well, and now Sony will market hardware in VHS for the first time.
While new Betamax decks were introduced in the US as late as 1993 and blank tapes were available as late as 2016, the format war really ended on Monday, January 11th, 1988, when Sony finally caved and announced it would manufacture its first VHS machines, or more accurately, rebrand some Hitachi VCRs. Sony didn't start manufacturing their own until late that year. Funnily enough, as little as 4 days before the big announcement, Sony, in an all-time great example of corporate spin, continued to deny the then ongoing rumors. Anyway, at the time, Beta's market share, depending on your source, was somewhere in the 9 to 12% range. By the time the last US Beta rolled off the line in 1994, the market share was down to 1%.
Of videotape recorder, we think that it's our responsibility to meet with those diversifying demands of the customer.
6-hour Select-O-Vision. Ah, the new video cassette recorder from RCA.
I've said it before, and I guess I'll say it again. The reason VHS won the format war was a perfect storm of greater accessibility, remember it was ostensibly an open format, usually lower prices, longer recording times, a greater willingness to shoot for user friendliness, and fewer necessary external toys. Not that Betamax was bad. If anything, it found itself at the technological vanguard more often than VHS, and at its best, was of somewhat better quality. And as much as I hate discussing it, I guess I'll mention the internet popular pornography theory one last time. While I certainly don't doubt that adult film at least helped a little with the adoption of home video, I've seen no evidence whatsoever that it held any sway over the VHS beta format war. Contrary to ever popular rumor, neither Sony nor JVC had any control over what was released on their respective formats. It was down to what the producers of such material chose to use. Get over it, Internet.
My new JVC Compact VCR is the world's smallest, lightest VCR ever. It's ideal for taping graduation, school plays, Halloween.
While I can't find any concrete proof, the popularly known date for the introduction of VHS Compact, or Compact VHS, or VHS-C, is June 1st, 1982. And yes, like regular VHS, it was JVC that was behind this one. Anyway, the first VHS and Betamax camcorders started flying around in the late 70s. Given that all-in-one camcorders weren't quite a thing yet, they were all still large, heavy, two-piece portapacks at the time, JVC's idea was to, in the short term, come up with a lightweight alternative. As such, the first VHS-C camcorders brought the weight of the portable VCR, the part that did the recording, down to about 4 or 5 pounds, as opposed to the then common 20 or more. Now, I mentioned the short term. JVC had wanted to introduce an all-in-one camcorder, but couldn't quite pull it off yet. The release of VHS-C was hastened when Sony announced a forthcoming all-in-one standard Betamax camcorder. If nothing else, JVC got their smaller Portapak out the door about a year before the Sony all-in-one camcorder. JVC got their first all-in-one out the door in 1984 with the GR-C1.
It began as an idea, a video camera and VHS recorder, all in one.
As always, JVC wanted their new product to be compatible with existing VHS. In this case, while there wasn't quite yet a means of popping your VHS-C tapes into your regular VHS deck, JVC made sure that these camcorders, both the Portapak and the subsequent all-in-one, could be easily hooked up to just about any existing TV. To further ensure a foothold in the market, VHS-C was also notable for being the first camcorder to break the $500 mark, albeit only in basic fixed focus models. Amazingly, it took a few years, but around 1986-87, the VHS-C adapter finally hit the market, available in both motorized and manual models. I personally recommend the latter, finally allowing anybody to stick their VHS-C tapes into their regular VHS VCRs. However, I should note that these adapters put a little extra strain on the tape. Use the adapters responsibly.
Look what just popped up.
In 1985, Sony took another crack at the home video market with Video 8, which, while it did have some pre-recorded titles, it became obvious very quickly that it was really more of a camcorder format. Coupled with the threat of Sony's concurrent Super Beta, in early 1988, Panasonic, in tandem with JVC, same owners back then, decided to preempt the Super Beta camcorder with an equivalent compact version of the then new SVHS. This was known as SVHS-C.
We're shooting this with a JVC compact VHS camcorder. The gentleman we're watching is trying to play an 8mm camcorder tape on his VCR.
Once established, both VHS-C and SVHS-C had a long, successful, and rather uneventful life. For the remainder of the existence of tape-based camcorders in general, it became less about new formats, though they certainly still happened, and more about refining existing technology. The formats themselves became almost secondary. The overall demise of VHS-C more or less coincided with the end of standard VHS in the late 2000s. Well, that's it for this installment of the world's longest VHS primer. Join us next time when, this being the archive, I probably do something that involves me leaning on even more VHS footage. It's a vicious cycle. Testing.
Testing.